spoke of the impression produced, even in France, by these frequent annexations of provinces and by these changes of allies which disturbed the loyalties of the people. I told the emperor that instead of looking on these things as advantages, people were disturbed by them and were made anxious about the future. And I added the following reflections on these points. These amazing extensions of power were, I thought, destructive to the feeling of stability and actually prevented that feeling of confidence through which institutions acquire their sanctity. Even those who flattered him felt that while his genius might make these new structures last for his lifetime, they would never last beyond it. People did not dare to tell him so, but they thought so. And this opinion was all the more strongly held for being suppressed. It was felt that he was creating great difficulties for his son. He was arming Europe in advance against the King of Rome, and even against his family. And it was a pity, when founding a new dynasty, to give room for a growing expectation of some change. No one would be able to support the burden of that colossus, which the course of events and the vigor of his rule were now setting in motion. These diverse nations would never make Frenchmen. These Rhinelanders already were finding it hard to persuade themselves that they had become French. The emperor admitted with absolute frankness the justice of my remarks. He did, however, rebut several of them. I shall create institutions, he said, to strengthen the organization I set up. No one can foretell what sacrifices I might not make, and even gladly to secure such a state of affairs in Europe as would guarantee a lasting peace to all people, and which would guarantee to the French and to the Germans domestic prosperity such as the English enjoy. They are a worthy people, the Germans, he added. They must be repaid for the sacrifices they have made. I am not clinging to Hamburg or to any other place in particular. I am not one of those narrow-minded men who see things from only one point of view and are obstinate on a question. There will be many ways of arranging things as soon as the English make up their minds to peace and agree to concede to other of those rights and privileges which heaven never intended for them alone. We can never make peace with the English unless we have compensations to offer them, because among them, the ministry have a responsibility toward the people out which they must be set at rest. They cannot take so decisive a step as making peace with France unless they can say to the nation, we have made a certain sacrifice for such and such reasons, but here are the compensations made to us and the advantages we have gained. There is a delicate and difficult relationship between the country and the ministry, and still more so, therefore, between the ministry and myself. Without this English peace, however, all others are merely truces. The English are playing for too high stakes to give way lightly. They know very well that I shall take advantage of a peace to establish a navy, that I shall not allow ourselves to be robbed again of our commercial capital during a state of peace. They know that a navy in my hands could do them considerable damage. If they were sure that I should live only 3 or 4 years more, they would make peace tomorrow. For the difficulty of the question lies in the navy that I shall have, that I shall build up within a few years. He added further that he had greater need of peace than anyone, and frankly desired it. How could anyone doubt that? He did not live under canvas for his own pleasure. It was the English who would not decide upon peace, and who, according to him, might not be in a position to decide upon it, being afraid of the future. The English ministry included some clever men who could not have overlooked any of the major considerations of which he spoke. He was well aware that the institutions of France were incomplete. He did not disguise from himself that peace alone would put him in a position to give them their full development. And who could doubt that he desired peace, when only peace could consolidate this achievement? In the forefront of those institutions he put to the Senate, which by no means enjoyed the independence it must have if it were to command respect enough to influence the opinion of the country. He told me that he would raise it to the status of a Chambre des Peers. The The emperor pointed out that the failure of this campaign was an obstacle to everything. There had to be a buffer state as an outpost against eruptions from the north and to exercise a moderating influence on the ambitions of other powers. Europe owed its misfortunes to the weakness of the Bourbons in allowing a partition of Poland. The Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia fully realized the mistake that had been made. They had quite openly entered the war against Russia solely because they were the people most interested in the creation of this barrier. The Austrians expected, through these arrangements, to obtain a redistribution of territory which would give them necessary outlets for their trade. The King of Prussia flattered himself, perhaps, that the new state would come under his rule. The Emperor added further that the silence maintained by the Russians towards the Austrians when the latter attempted mediation before the opening of the campaign had left the Emperor Francis in no doubt as to the ambitious intentions of Tsar Alexander. Francis had told him so several times at Dresden. The Russian government snatched with both hands from the friends as much as from enemies. Everything looked good to them. After Tilsit, they had profited at the expense of their allies, the Prussians. After the war against Austria, they had accepted a portion of Galicia. No delicate scruples ever hindered the Tsar from rounding off his territory. The Emperor put forward that the reflection that the Tsar, with his gentle methods and air of moderation, had done more for the interests of Russia than the ambitious Catherine whom they idolized, and that Finland was far greater importance to an empire whose capital was at Petersburg than the uninhabited Crimea and all that which Catherine had conquered from the Turks. The emperor kept reverting to the idea that the Austrians desired the restoration of Poland and that they were by no means set on retaining what remained to them of Galicia, adding that, at the Peace of Vienna, they would gladly have surrendered their millions of Galicians for a part of Valeria, no matter what, or for a few fragments of territory on the Inn. This arrangement could be made, therefore, whenever he wished. His father-in-law had urged it upon him at Dresden, and indeed had probably come there in the hope of concluding the matter. He, however, had wished to be of the attitude of the Lithuanians, and to see for himself whether the Poles were capable of becoming and remaining an independent country. The result of this policy was that he had not yet set all the Poles free, and events were proving him right. He would soon be able to see whether they were as worthy of independence nationally as they were individually. For adversity steals a gallant spirit more than prosperity. He intended to speak to that effect at Warsaw. He would tell the Poles all their misfortunes and even all the dangers in which they stood, but he would tell them also all that he hoped for if they, as a nation, would second him. I pointed out to the emperor that the lack of unity and zeal of which he complained on the part of the Poles was surely due to his leaving them in too great uncertainty about their future. In practice, there was no limit to the sacrifices asked of them. The unfortunate duchy, after furnishing supplies for everything over a long period, seemed now to be exhausted, and even the richest no longer had a penny to their names. I reminded him that I had always appreciated the advantages of this restoration, for it would form a buffer state, and held that this motive was sufficient, as I had the honor of telling him in other circumstances, to justify the war against Russia. But for several years, I, like many others, and even some of the Poles, had seen in his references to Poland and in the measures he had taken only a method of arriving through that restoration at a different goal. In fact, Poland had become a military and political stepping stone. Moreover, I pointed out to him jokingly that everything he told me about his conversations at Dresden with the Emperor Francis, about his refusal to give up Illyria and to the Austrians, and indeed about all that had passed between M. Bassano and M. Metternich, showed me that he wanted to hold over Austria his power of giving or refusing according to the circumstances. He wished always to be able to make use of the Poles. I told him to stimulate them with hope, but not to make any undertaking so definite as to inconvenience his further plans or prevent him from adapting his course of action to future events. I added that when Poland was once restored, the Poles would show scant eagerness to supply us with troops to fight in Spain. In fact, it was perfectly plain that if he really had been guided by those broad European considerations that demand a buffer state, he would at once have indemnified the Austrians for the loss of their Polish interests and proclaimed the restoration of Poland.